and I have with me Mr. Ali Wine. He's a senior analyst with Eurasia Group's Global Macro Geopolitics Practice. He's the author of the new book, America's Great Power Opportunity, Revitalizing U.S. Foreign Policy to Meet the Challenges of the Strategic Competition. And I requested Mr. Ali Wine for his time to talk about his new book, which is in the market, which is available on the Amazon. You can go and see and read the book. And for that matter, I requested him to tell us what he has written in the book. So thank you very much, Ali, for your time for my channel.
Dr. Cheema, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor and privilege to be with you.
Thank you very much. So first of all, we're starting. What motivated you to write a book, first of all? I know you are a researcher. You have been writing, talking. You are based in DC, and you have a lot of input and you have a lot of understanding what's going on in DC and about the American power. And I was also looking at the Professor Joseph Nye was also recommending and talking about your book. So what basically motivated you to write this book?
Well, thank you again for having me on your show. It's really a privilege to be with you. So I first began writing this book in earnest in late 2019, and the impetus for me was trying to understand this term great power competition. So great power competition, it had slowly been percolating in the analytical community in the United States, in the policymaking community, in I would say the mid 2010s. So when Russia launched its incursion into Ukraine and then annexed Crimea, that development prompted some discussion of great power competition. As China started reclaiming more territory in the South China Sea gradually, that phenomena stoked more discussion of great power competition. But the real inflection point, when this term great power competition goes from being not a fringe term, but it goes from being kind of an esoteric kind of academic term, and it really achieves this escape velocity. It comes in late 2017 and early 2018. So in late 2017, the Trump administration publishes its national security strategy, which places great power competition front and center. And then 1 month later, in January 2018, the Department of Defense releases its national defense strategy, flowing from the national security strategy. And that document as well places great power competition front and center. And so with those two documents, with the publication of those two documents, this term, it really just exploded. And what I discovered was, so at the time I was working at the RAND Corporation, and I'm somebody who's interested in U.S. foreign policy. I'm interested in world affairs, and everywhere I would go, at pretty much every other article I would read, every testimony I would read, every interview I would read, every event that I would attend, would make some reference to this concept. And so I said, well, if I want, as someone who's interested in U.S. foreign policy, if this term or if this construct is going to be this ubiquitous, if it's really going to dominate our conversations, I better get a handle on it. And so I started writing this book, and just to inform my own research, I started interviewing individuals and asking them, well, what is great power competition? And what I found was this gap between the ubiquity of the term on the one hand, because as I said, it really started appearing everywhere. So it was ubiquitous on the one hand, but it was underspecified. Well, what do I mean? It's underspecified in the sense that if you ask most individuals, what does great power competition mean? Most observers will agree at a 30,000 foot level. So most observers will say, well, great power competition means that the United States today isn't relatively as influential as it was, say, at the end of the Cold War, or maybe even 2 decades ago. And China and Russia in particular, they're more able and they're more willing to push back. But when you sort of come down a little bit from that 30,000 foot view and say, okay, given that very general description that the balance of power is more contested, what are the implications for U.S. foreign policy? You get a lot of disagreement. And so you have many scholars and many policymakers both citing great power competition who will often advocate very different policies. And so I set out to write the book to try and narrow the gap between the ubiquity of the term and the underspecification of the term. And as I wrote the book, what I discovered in the process of writing the book, doing more research, interviewing more individuals, was that in part because this term or this construct was rather underspecified, the interpretations of what its implications were for U.S. foreign policy started becoming more and more expansive, more and more maximalist, such that now, if you ask people what are the implications of great power competition for U.S. foreign policy, you very often will hear an answer that says, the United States is in this long-term, systemic, multidimensional competition with China and Russia to determine the future of the world. Now, you may agree with that diagnosis, The problem is, though, when you have so sweeping a diagnosis, when you have so expansive a problem statement, the challenge is not identifying what to do. The challenge is identifying what not to do, because what couldn't conceivably fall under the banner of determining the future of the world. And so I wrote this book. I wrote this book to basically make an argument that, of course, the United States is obviously, its relationship with China is growing more strained. Its relationship with Russia obviously is much more strained. So of course it needs to be vigilant about what those two countries are doing. It obviously has to manage its strategic frictions with those two countries. But it needs to be selective about how it competes. America can't do everything, even though it is the world's preeminent power. It can't do everything, so it needs to compete selectively. It needs to compete prudently, and it needs to compete sustainably. And I'll just make one last point, and then I'll stop. What I try to argue in the book is that rather than articulating and pursuing a foreign policy that's driven by or beholden to what China and Russia are doing, the United States should be able to articulate and pursue a foreign policy without invoking its competitors. We should be able to articulate our purposes in the world without invoking our competitors. And so that's really kind of the great power opportunity that I mentioned in the title is, if we in the United States, if we succeed in pursuing a foreign policy that can stand on its own merits, that articulates an affirmative vision, that speaks to what it is that we seek to do, rather than just what we seek to oppose, I think that we'll not only be able to signal confidence to our allies and partners, I think that we'll be able to proceed in a much more confident way.
Thank you very much for giving us a holistic picture that what motivated and how you did that. Ali, you have mentioned that the America have to manage the resurgent China. So what do you mean by that? How do you believe? What do you believe that how America can manage China? Because it's not just the power is not just, it's not military, it's not just economics, it's not just politics. There's so much on the plate. So what have you talked and what have you written that how America can manage the resurgent China?
So the fundamental precondition for managing a resurgent China is an acknowledgement that for all of China's socioeconomic challenges at home, for all of its external constraints abroad, we can't theoretically rule out the possibility that China might experience a hard landing economically, that China's leader, that the Chinese Communist Party might implode in spectacular fashion. But I think that those are very, at least as far as I can tell, or as I would assess, I think that those are very unlikely scenarios. I think that the far more likely scenario is one in which China it muddles along. It faces challenges abroad. It faces challenges at home. It faces challenges abroad. But my hypothesis would be that China is likely to endure in one form or another, and I think that it's going to be a serious competitor and a multidimensional competitor to the United States in perpetuity. And so the first precondition for managing a resurgent China is shifting away from conceptions of total victory to conceptions of strained cohabitation. I think the notion or the idea that the United States it's not even clear to me what it would mean for the United States to quote unquote beat China or achieve victory over China. The United States and China, for all the talk about decoupling, they remain substantially intertwined economically. And the United States and China, whether they like it or not, and they probably don't like it because they're competing so intensely, but they have to cooperate on a number of transnational issues that implicate each country's vital national interests. Whether we're talking about mitigating climate change, whether we're talking about mitigating pandemic disease, whether we're talking about mitigating nuclear proliferation, and we can go on and on and on. But when you have two countries that are so intertwined economically and technologically, when you have two countries that share so many vital national interests, we're going to have to find a way to get on. So I think so step one is acknowledging that China is likely here to stay. It's likely to endure as a competitor in some form. So that's step one. Then step two, obviously, we have to think about if these two countries are going to endure, then step two is we have to avoid a great power war. If we don't avoid a great power war, then basically every other conversation about U.S.-China relations kind of becomes irrelevant. So acknowledge that China is likely to endure, number one. Number two, how can these two countries avoid a great power war? Now that means that they have to increase their military-to-military communication, and their military-to-military communication, it's slowly growing, but it still is very, very impoverished. It's very nascent. So they have to build that military-to-military communication. They have to engage in confidence-building exercises. And I think that they also have to have a very candid dialogue about potential contingencies that might bring the two to the brink of confrontation. But step number two, they must avoid a great power war. If, and I hope that they are able to avoid that great power military confrontation, then step three is what are some broader guardrails that the two countries can impose that can basically prevent their relationship from deteriorating indefinitely? And that requires, in order to impose those guardrails, it's not enough to have just different sort of working groups or different sort of lower level officials in both countries who are talking. You really need to have from the very, very top, and this means you need to have President Joe Biden in the United States and you need to have President Xi Jinping in China, who at the leader level agree to impose guardrails and decide on what those guardrails could be. If President Biden and President Xi say we need to get this relationship under control, their guidance will then inform what their advisors will do. So that's an important step. And then lastly, and then I'll stop here. Obviously, competitive dynamics are going to probably dominate the relationship between the United States and China. But we need to figure out a way to cooperate, even if right now the prospects for cooperation seem dim. And so my argument would be, there's some observers who say, cooperation between the United States and China, it's a fool's errand, or maybe even it's an exhibition of strategic weakness. I think that argument is misguided. These two countries have to find a way of getting on. So even if there are limited possibilities for cooperation, I think that we should avail ourselves of those opportunities. Because what we need to do right now is to demonstrate that some cooperation is possible. That cooperation might be limited, it might be incremental, it might be small scale, it might not seem like it's accomplishing that much, but it signals to both countries that, hey, we were able, in this very, very difficult geopolitical environment, we were at least able to achieve some cooperative successes. So maybe those could pave the way for future cooperative successes in a broader sense. So I realize that I think I made 4 points about how the United States can manage a resurgent China. Obviously, I didn't give a satisfactory answer because it's a very difficult relationship. But I'll make one last point and then stop. I think that very often when we talk about great power relations, whether between the United States and China, between the United States and Russia, we often talk about countries as being prisoners of history or prisoners of structural forces. And I think it's very important that we reject that view. And I think it's very important that we recognize that structural trends are driven by human decisions. It's the decisions that human beings make, whether as citizens, as business leaders, as academics, as policymakers. It's decisions that individuals in these countries make that determine those structural trends. And so if policymakers in the United States and China make a conscious decision that despite difficult domestic political dynamics and despite a difficult set of structural trends, if they make a conscious decision at the leader level that we have to figure out a way to coexist, they're likely to be able to steer the relationship in a more productive direction.
So, Ali, obviously, what we have understood is that the American power depends on its alliances. It was transatlantic alliance, which we saw that after the Cold War, and during the Cold War, that gave America so much power. In recent, the Russian aggression on Ukraine, what we have seen is that I think, as per the Economist Intelligence Unit, I think somewhere around 34% of the world supported the American-led sanctions on Russia. But the rest of the world was still either abstaining or siding with the Russians. So how do you see that the way the world is dependent on China, and as we know, this is the age of the complex interdependence, and we are just like in a cobweb model. The world is a cobweb model, and we're so much dependent that I think today the American Congress had to withdraw some of its had to change the CAATSA Act to favor India for that matter. So how do you see that? Will America be in a position to, in case of any kind of a future war and in case of any kind of a future conflict, to have a support of the international society the way the world is dependent on China? And so keeping in mind that resurgent China, please do answer this question.
It's such an important question. I'll talk a little bit about Russia and then I'll turn to China. So, with Russia, there was initially this narrative, at least in some circles, when in the initial days and initial weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine, you saw this kind of triumphalist narrative that it's the whole world on one side and Russia isolated as a pariah. Now, if you look at if you sort of zoom in on just advanced industrial democracies, there's some purchase to that narrative. So, for example, in the G7, G7 discussions will cast Russia as a pariah. If you zoom out a little bit to say the G20, Russia's diplomatic isolation doesn't look as pronounced. If you zoom out even further to say the UN General Assembly, Russia doesn't really look like much of a pariah. certainly not in many stretches of the developing world, and even among certain powerful uh, allies and partners of the United States. You mentioned India. I think that India is an interesting example in this regard. So in terms of pushing back against China's influence, India, both bilaterally with the United States and under the auspices of the Quad, it's aligning itself much more openly with the United States, but it's not aligning itself nearly as much with the United States when it comes to dealing with Russia, because India, it has a historical relationship with Russia for energy, for weapons. And so I think that what we're going to, so that's, and I think that your point about sanctions, you're right that the vast majority of the world's countries have elected not to sanction Russia. Um, Given how much more central China is to the global economy than Russia, I think that China's economy is somewhere on the order of at least 10 times as large as the Russian economy, if not more. So China's economy is vastly larger than Russia's economy. China is far more important to global supply chains than Russia is. And so I think that and it's a very, very scary scenario to contemplate, if China were to launch an attack on Taiwan, I think that it would be much more difficult, given. I think it would be much more difficult than it's been in responding to Russian aggression. I think that it would be far more difficult to mobilize a really a global response to Chinese aggression, in part because of what you just said, Dr. Cheema, just the level of dependence on China's economy, the level of China's integration into the global economy. And so I think that what we're going to see, and we're beginning to see this phenomena take place in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I imagine that we might see kind of a comparable dynamic play out if China were to attack Taiwan. What we're seeing in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine is, among a set of advanced industrial democracies, you see right now, at least, and again, I want to emphasize for the time being, you see a certain level of cohesion. And I don't think that Russia anticipated that the West in particular would respond with such powerful sanctions and would respond so swiftly. The difficulty, though, is that as the shock of Russia's invasion recedes, as this war kind of grinds on into this war of attrition, and as the consequences of this war grow more pronounced, it's going to become more and more difficult to sustain that cohesion, even among the West. So, just as one watch point, what's going to happen to Europe's response when the winter arrives? When the winter arrives and Europe has reduced gas supplies from Russia, it's going to be very difficult for many European leaders to say to their publics, even though it's cold, the winter has arrived, and the public is struggling. We have to maintain this united front on Russia. It's going to become more difficult. So as energy disruptions increase, as food insecurity increases, it's going to become much more difficult for the West to maintain that unity. Point number one. Point number two, I mentioned India, but there are other examples of countries as well that they might align with the United States to say contest China, but not to contest Russia, and also the other way around. And point number three that I would make, one of the reasons that I think sort of the great power competition framework is somewhat limited is when we talk about great power competition, we typically talk about three powers that are typically considered great. And I realize that sort of the criteria for designating a power as great, they're intrinsically subjective. But typically we're talking about the United States, we're talking about China, and we're talking about Russia. Well, three countries, that excludes the vast majority of the world's countries. The vast majority of the world's countries, they want to avoid getting caught up in a new Cold War or a new great power competition. They may not like what Russia is doing. They may not like what China is doing, but they realize that they don't have the economic capacity. They don't have the strategic autonomy to say, well, Russia, in light of your human rights violations, we're going to stand up to you and basically discard our relationship with you. China, in light of your human rights abuses, we're going to stand up and discard our relationship. The vast majority of the world's countries don't have, they're not able to do so. And so I think that we are entering into a period of geopolitics that's going to be much more fluid, much more messy, in which the alignments are shifting. They're not as sort of set in stone. And so even if, again, and then I'll stop, even if we sort of zoom out, if you look at the level of sort of advanced industrial democracies, I think it's fair to say that advanced industrial democracies are aligning themselves more closely and are coordinating more closely to contest China or Russia. But advanced industrial democracies are not necessarily going to be uniform in their policies indefinitely. And when we look beyond advanced industrial democracies and really consider the world in its totality, I think most countries are going to say, look, we've been through one world war, we've been through a second world war. The Cold War was a very, very devastating period for many countries and many regions across the world. So I think that many countries will say, look, we're going to hold our nose. We don't like what Russia's doing. We don't like what China's doing, but we have to maintain some baseline of diplomacy with them. And that's going to create challenges for the United States.
Ali, in your book, you have spoken about obviously China, you have spoken about Russia as well. But have you spoken about, or obviously, have you written about what we call, what Farid Zakaria called the rise of the rest? So, how the other powers, like to whom we call as semi-peripheries, for instance, when President Joe Biden was during his election campaign was saying that we will make Saudi Arabia a pariah state, but then he has to go there because he didn't know things will emerge that way. So,
Yeah.
what in assessing America's great power opportunity, what have you basically spoken about the rest of the world, about India, about Brazil, about Saudi Arabia, about Turkey, and all these countries which are semi periphery, and at the end of the day, they are part of the SCO. They are part of the Western alliances. They are part of the other alliances. So, where do you fit in? To whom, on whom support America obviously wants to have to stay great power.
So this question that you just posed, Dr. Cheema, this is one of the most important questions for the United States because the emerging, you could say, geopolitical geometry, it's much more complicated than it was during the Cold War. So in the Cold War, it's true that there was a very large non-aligned movement, but the real crux of competition during the Cold War, it was centered on NATO members versus Warsaw Pact members, and the ideological divisions were much more rigid, much more sort of set in stone. And I think that what we're seeing now is that those divisions, they're not as rigid as they used to be. So I think that increasingly now, and to your point, you have a number of countries, call them middle powers, for lack of a more elegant term, but you have a lot of middle powers who, again, they align with the United States on certain issues and in certain instances, but not on other issues and in other instances. So just to give one sort of concrete example, take trade. So you have certain countries that are a member of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is kind of China's preferred large trade agreement, but who have also signed up to be members of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And so what they basically are signaling is we don't want to choose between the United States and China. When the United States brings offerings to the table that we like, we'll capitalize on them. If and when China brings offerings to the table that we like, we will capitalize on them. And I think that many, many countries, whether it's the Indias, the Brazils, the South Africas, a number of kind of middle powers who are basically trying to maximize their own freedom of foreign policy maneuver by interacting with each of these great powers, by playing these great powers off of one another. I think that that's kind of sort of that is in many ways, I think, kind of the story to come. And so I think that increasingly for the United States, so what does it mean for the United States? It means, number one, that it's going to have to be, I think, much more flexible, much more nimble, much more adept in how it manages its diplomacy. It can't assume that even core allies and partners, and certainly not countries outside of that set of core allies and partners, it can't assume that countries will align with it uniformly on all issues. It'll have to sort of take alignment where it can get it. So again, when it can get alignment on certain issues, take it, but recognizing that it's not going to be able to get total alignment from countries. And I think that number three, and this goes back to a point that I was making just a few minutes ago, if these two other great powers, China and Russia, if one accepts that they are likely here to stay, that they're going to endure in one fashion or another, then these middle powers that we've been talking about, they're going to maintain a baseline of interaction with those other great powers indefinitely because they realize that these countries, or they believe that these countries, are here to stay. And that answer for the United States, it's not satisfactory. But again, I think that a key to any successful, durable, prudent U.S. foreign policy, you have to acknowledge the world as it is. You have to see the world as it is. And the geopolitical environment that prevails today is not the geopolitical environment that prevailed in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. It's much more complex. It's much more contested. Now, having said that, I still think that the United States, I do think that it retains a number of competitive advantages that in some cases are unique. And again, this is not 1991. The United States has a lot of work to do at home and abroad. But I think that the United States, and this is what I talk about with this notion of a great power sort of opportunity, is can the United States articulate and pursue a foreign policy that doesn't depend on sort of reflexively invoking China or Russia. Obviously, managing strategic frictions with those two countries will be a critical and enduring task for U.S. foreign policy, but we should be able to articulate our purposes in the world without invoking them. And to sort of to use your phrase and Dr. Zakaria's phrase, sort of the rise of the rest, we really need to in the United States, I think in a much more proactive way, rather than so I'm sitting at a table right now, so just to use a metaphor, rather than thinking about the United States sitting at the head of the table and talking to its allies and partners, or talking to other countries that comprise the rest, I think instead we need to have sort of a broader table. Maybe we sit at the center of the table, or we sit at the head of the table, but we need to have everybody else at that table, and we need to be saying, look. So whether we're talking with core allies and partners, whether we're talking with middle countries that align with us on some issues but not on other issues, we need to have a much larger table, and we need to have a conversation at that table that says, look, the international system that we set up after 1945, that's still it's fraying and it's eroding, but it still exists in some form today. It's increasingly ill fit to purpose. We've had a coronavirus pandemic. The international system did not respond effectively. We've now had Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The international community is struggling to respond. So we're at one of those kind of present at the creation moments, to use Dean Acheson's phrase. We're at one of those present at the creation moments in which there's a real widespread and growing recognition that this international system we have, it's not fit for purpose. And so if I were sort of advising, U.S. policymakers, and U.S. policymakers are now thinking very actively in this way, it's what does a more resilient international system look like? How do we incorporate not only our core allies and partners, but how do we incorporate countries that say, look, we don't want to be trapped within this great power competition framework, but we do want to contribute to this conversation on building a more resilient international order. So setting up a larger table, inviting a larger set of participants, and importantly, going back to this point about kind of flexible or variable geopolitical geometry, recognizing that if you want to build a more resilient international order, you're not going to be able to get agreement among every participant at the table. What you have to do instead is, on an issue by issue basis, you set up flexible dynamic coalitions. So for example, when it comes to trade, maybe you have a certain coalition of countries. When it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to energy, when it comes to pushing back on Russia. So on an issue by issue basis, you build up a dynamic set of partnerships, and the hope is that that dynamic set of issue-specific partnerships over time, it builds a kind of durable, dense lattice work that can hopefully undergird a more resilient international system.
Yes, obviously this is a very complex understanding of having the great power competition, and understanding even the American power is very complex. So thank you very much, Ali, for giving us a detailed understanding about the book you have written, America's Great Power Opportunity: Revitalizing U.S. Foreign Policy to Meet the Challenges of Strategic Competition. I will share the link of the Amazon link so that those of our viewers who want to read and want to comment on talk on that, they can do that. So, but thank you very much for your time and for helping us to understand your book, Ali.
Dr. Cheema, it was a real honor and privilege to be with you. Thank you so much for having me on your program.